All right, we are going to start now looking at our Chapter 6 content. So I am going to download that PowerPoint and get that all opened and set to go. But before I dig into that, we're going to start looking at some of the assignments here. So we had just finished Chapter 5 and talked about all these, web design principles and best practices and our author's checklist. And then we come to this assignment here. So this assignment really takes us back to unit, I think, 0 or 1 or wherever, like way back, where I asked you, like, what are some possible projects that you might choose for this class? And then each of you sent in a document with what you thought possibilities could be. And then I responded to it. Most often I'm like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that. Sometimes I would give you some tips. But now we're at the point where we have to start building that site because the semester's starting to run out. And so you have to pick one of those possibilities. Now, if you want to do something completely different than what you originally picked, that's absolutely fine. But I would ask that maybe you just pop me an email and go, hey, I'm thinking about doing this for my project. What do you think? And then I'll give you a blessing or, like a suggestion. If I already gave you approval on something and you want to do that, then you're all set. So then all you have to do is create this verbal description of the project, right? So it should include a website name, talk about your target audience, what the site will do, the type of information it will provide, and the type of content that you might include. This should be in a Word document. So you can create a Word document to do this. In fact, all 3 of these bullet points should be part of a Word document, ideally. That's what I would think is the best format. Next, we want to create a sitemap. Okay, so a sitemap looks like what? And maybe I should have left that previous slideshow open. So I'm going to go back to the Chapter 5 thing. And folks, this is a sitemap, per the book definition. So when you work on your Java Jam or your Fish Creek websites, for example, I don't know if you remember back to like Chapter 2, but they had a little diagram like this, which is a sitemap. And I don't know if you noticed, they also had a wireframe, but the sitemap was there because they already had an idea of like, I'm going to build this page and this page and this page and this page. And I want you guys to do the same thing. So before you build the pages, I want to see what your hierarchy should look like. All right. So now you get to the question, all right, Ty, how do I actually create this drawing, right? So like if you're using Microsoft Word, there's drawing tools inside of Microsoft Word that you can use. Okay, that would be one way. You could also use a graphics program. That's up to you. You could also use Google Docs to do this. Now, in my archive videos, I think I demonstrate mostly with Microsoft Word. So I thought that this time around, it might be a little bit more interesting to go to my Google Drive here, create a new document, and then I'm going to go to the insert menu and I'm going to insert a drawing. And I want you to notice here, I'm going to select new from the insert menu, drawing. And then they bring up this drawing tool palette and you're like, well, how do I create a drawing like the one that we were seeing? Well, basically you're going to use the shape tool that they have here, right? So just to give you an example, and we're not looking for like beautiful perfection, but they have boxes, right? See the different kind of boxes they have. And if I remember right, they were kind of boxes with kind of rounded corners, and that one kind of looks like that. So I could do a box like this, and then once you draw the box, you can type home. Pretty simple, right? And there it is. I guess that could be centered, so you could find the centering thing here. So there it is, centered. And then you probably noticed that they had lines. So for example, I could draw a line straight down, and then I could start drawing more boxes. In fact, I could also, by the way, just click on the box, copy it and paste it, and then just move it around the screen, right? So you might have on your website an about page. You might have I'm speculating here on like what pages you might have, maybe a gallery, or contact or products or, right? So it depends on what your site is. But the grand goal here is that, you create the drawing, and see even the lines can be copy pasted, right? And then what you might want to do here is kind of do this kind of stuff. So they have all the tools here that you need to basically do the drawing. But I need to see what pages you're going to create is really what this is about. So some people will draw it like this, home pages at the top and then your top level pages. And if you happen to have like a second level pages, they can come down here, just like what you're seeing in the slide, right? So that's kind of your target. Now, when I think of a sitemap, I'll be real frank, I don't think of home as sitting on top. I always think of home as sitting at the same level with these other ones. So if you drew it like home, about, contact, products, like that, that would be fine too, right? But I think that having a sitemap is really helpful, at least to name your pages. So once you have your drawing all done, this one's not done, but it'll drop into the document like this. And then you can download, where is that? Share, right here, download as Microsoft Word or a PDF or something like that for turning it into me, right? So that's one way to do it. If you are doing that in Microsoft Word, for those of you that are interested, you can also go to the insert menu here, go to shapes, and then you'll notice they have all the same kind of shapes, right? And then just for example, right? Pretty easy to create. So you might want to do it inside of Microsoft Word. You might want to do it inside of Google Docs, whatever is more comfortable for you, I think is a good tool. All right. So that would be looking at creating the sitemap. The last piece would be to create a wireframe. So once again, I'm going to go back to that chapter 5 PowerPoint for just a minute. And farther down in the presentation here, they started talking about wireframes as being kind of like a rough sketch of your website. Now, people sometimes will create these in a bunch of different ways. I think that probably a really easy way to do it is just the same way that I was doing the stuff here, which is where I can insert shapes and just draw right in this environment. I can also, once again, go back to Google Docs, wherever the heck that is, here, right? And I could insert another drawing and make just a fresh drawing that was my wireframe. And so, like, for example, I might create a big square, which is the whole screen, right? And then if I want to drop in an image, I can actually find images and drop them in, or just create little boxes, that may be another little box inside here. And then you can just add words that say picture of, whatever it is. Okay. So once again, creating a rough look of what the screen looks like. Now, really practically, like what a lot of people will say is, that's really, really rough. Are there any tools online that I could use to create a wireframe without having to struggle so hard? So you know what? Yeah, there's a bunch. One real popular one, see if I can spell it. It's balsamic with a Q. And I'm trying to remember how do I get right to wireframes right there. And I'm not finding the easy way to get into the product here. I thought they used to have a way. Okay. Boy, they really want you to sign up, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this, right? If you guys don't want to do this, I totally get it. Right. So they really want me to dig deep here. All right, just bear with me here, folks. This is a really cool product, so it's kind of worth the hassle, but I have to, and then they want me to log in. So on the other screen here, I'm now logging in with the silly password I just created, if I can remember it. I could have signed in with Google and probably saved myself trouble, but here is Balsamic coming up on the screen. And see how they try to guide you every step of the way. But I just want to show you a tool that real professional user interface designers use to create wireframes. So if you really want to walk this path, you totally can. So they have like example kind of screens here, and I'm not really sure. So here they have a website sample. So this is a wireframe that's already pre-created, and they're just kind of setting it up. But if you wanted to create something from scratch, you totally can. And then you just come in here, and let's say this is your page. Well, what do you want your page to look like? And then you can start gathering from all the different like stuff here. So for example, if I wanted a button on my screen, there's my button. And whatever is the button, right? And then if I need a calendar, they have basically people all the tools that you need, right? Image placeholders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They just have all the stuff that's pre-created. The whole point of this is really that you can very quickly and easily kind of throw together a design and go, what do you think? Right? Now, if this seems like way too much trouble, because it might be, real frankly, you don't have to use a tool like this. You can use other graphics tools. So if you want Photoshop or Paint or whatever graphic tool you prefer to use. But I also like to point one out that's maybe almost too obvious. PowerPoint is actually not a bad tool to use for something like this, because I could create, for example, a new slide, and I can get rid of all the stuff that they have on here, right? So I could like get rid of these boxes, and then I could drop in images and words or lines or whatever I want, and kind of use this as my canvas for creating a wireframe also. So there's a bunch of different ways. Finally, I don't want to like neglect the fact that some people don't like to work on the screen to do this stuff. There are a lot of professionals that will use whiteboards or paper and pencil and then just snap a picture of it. So if you want to do that for your wireframe, if you're good at drawing by hand, I'm totally fine with that too. So that's kind of like how to do that assignment. And I think, that is a big question I get, as people try to tackle that particular assignment. So you can use Balsamic to do the work, but you can see why that is a little bit cumbersome. But this assignment is a verbal description, a sitemap. So my thinking is, you'd be somewhere around 5 or 6, 7 pages for your website total. And then a wireframe of generally what the website will look like. And it can be a really, really rough wireframe. And I'm going to show you like an example of a really rough wireframe. If you guys look at Unit 2, HTML Basics, and you look at the case study, right here I have the case study instructions, right? So this is a document from our book. And I just want to show you, here's the sitemap for Java Jam. Okay, that's really simple because there's only 4 pages. So I like to see a couple more pages. Really simple, really, really, really simple, right? And then they show you the wireframe for Java Jam, at least so far, right? But you know what? This approach, header at the top, navigation, footer at the bottom, and content in the middle, really common. That might be your design. Or maybe your design will have 3 columns in the middle. Or maybe the home page will look one way and your gallery page will look a different way. And this is, remember folks, this is an idea, not what the website's going to be. So that hopefully should help. And really, when I look at like what they've done here, here's a verbal description of the website, right? So this is kind of the assignment, a verbal description of the website, a sitemap for the website, and a wireframe. It's really that simple, folks. So that's how you do this assignment in Unit 5 called Site Design. Is very simply that. We need the verbal description, a sitemap, and a wireframe. And whatever wireframe you come up with, you might shoot for that design originally. It doesn't have to stay that design if you don't want to, by the way. The other kind of two assignments here, and I'm going to jump past the chapter 6 one, is the site building assignment. And this one becomes where you're taking the ideas from site design and now you're starting to build the website. Okay. And I want you to look at this because this is kind of like the HTML5 basics assignment from unit 2. And you notice how many bullet points I have, right? And so what you want to do when you do this assignment is you want to read each bullet point carefully, right? Create a folder, title it something useful. Create an images folder. Call your homepage index HTML. Create at least 2 additional pages, so you can have at least 3 pages for this assignment. You should already have 2, right? If you think about it, but you should have 3. Create links. Basically this is saying create navigation that allows you to go from page to page. Have at least 1 image per page. Optimize your images so they're not too big and they look good. Use good HTML structure, so all your tags should be done correctly. You must have a doc type, meta tags and all that. That's just normal stuff at this point. And then try to use as many of the different tags as you've learned as is feasible for your design. So I don't want you putting an ordered list on your gaming website if there's no point of it, if that makes sense to you. But if you can demonstrate all the code, that would be great. Now, some students, what they do here is they do create one separate page, which is like a code demo page. They build their whole site, and then they delete the code demo page and then have the site. So that's the thing. And then use some CSS in an external file, right? So these are all the requirements of the site. Now notice, I'm not really telling you what tags to use, but there's some that you're going to use anyhow. This is where your creativity kicks in and you're trying to fly on your own a little bit. And you know what? That can be a little bit daunting, but don't freak out to it, is what the advice I give to people. Read the bullet points, make sure you're doing this. I'm not looking for finished product here. I'm just looking for work in progress and that you're making an effort towards it. What will happen on all the other subsequent unit folders is that each week there will be something to add to your website. So in a couple of weeks, we'll add a form, to collect information. And then we'll add videos, and then we'll add music, and then et cetera. More CSS, so every week there'll be something to add, and you will be building the site week by week. And then when you get to that last week, you will have a completed project. So that is the site building assignment, right? So that's in this unit. And then finally, you have the unit 6 or the chapter 6 case studies that you do have to complete the chapter 5 case study first, but you're only turning in chapter 6. And if you look at the author's solution page, you'll notice there's no chapter 5 version because there's really no code for chapter 5. It's pretty darn minimal. So you're turning in the finished version of chapter 6 in unit 5. This last assignment, this is one that we're going to cover at the end of this presentation. And if I remember right, I think the due date is after, no, it's still by Friday. So that's the last thing that we're going to do today. I'm going to demonstrate that by doing it here in class. All right. So let's dig into the materials for chapter 6 now and start plugging away. All right. Learning objectives for chapter 6. This is a pretty important chapter in terms of how CSS works. And we're going to learn a really important thing called the box model first. And why this is important. I think I gave you a little bit of a preview last week, but today we dig into it full steam. And then working with margins, floats, fixed relative and absolute positioning. And then as you'll see is week by week now, we're going to start looking at different types of layouts. So the first kind of layout they're focusing on here is a 2-column page layout, which might look good on your website, might not. And then these other topics as well. Moving on into the first slide here, and this is an important slide. probably the most important slide in this whole presentation is what we call the CSS box model. The concept of this is anytime we are putting anything on a screen, by the nature of how a screen operates. Now, if you remember from the chapter 5 stuff, when we zoomed way in on that image, so much so that you could see the pixels of the image. And so what you're really discovering is that everything that goes on the screen is a square, and it's called a pixel. And so all the other shapes that we put on the screen are square or rectangular. And that's why we have a box model. So whenever you put content on the screen, that could be words, or it could be images, or other things too, for that matter, but typically words or images. That's called the content, and it sits inside of a container that is box shaped. It is rectangular or square. Every content item on the screen also has all of these other aspects attached to it, whether you see them or not, and are all individually controllable. So we have borders. We played with that last week a little bit. The default for borders is they're not visible, but you can turn borders on. And remember, you can make them thick or thin or solid or dashed or dotted or colored or all that stuff. And then inside the border and between the content and the border is an area called padding. Some objects have padding automatically built in, some do not, right? And then we can control that padding, so it's the space from the border to the content. Then outside the border, we have a thing called margin, which goes all the way around the object, and we can also control that spacing, and that controls the space between our current object and the objects adjacent. Really important is the fact that we have the top, right, bottom, and left, which is individually controllable for all of these aspects. So this is the mind blow on this one for me, is that so I can have only a top margin, no right, left, or bottom, and then I can have a bottom padding and a left padding, but no right or top. And I can have a border on the left and the right, but not on the top and the bottom. And I can control each one of those separately, right? It's kind of a lot to process in a sense, but at the same time, when you're putting things on the screen, sometimes you're like, I want it a little over that way, or a little up this way, or I want this effect to happen. And how do I get that? That's why they developed this. The thing that I always tell people is the acronym you have to remember is that top, right, bottom, left. And what's the acronym? Trouble, right? Because when you're designing these, what happens is you kind of go around the circle clockwise as you're looking at it, top, right, bottom, left. And when I say padding in code or margin in code, I do it in that fashion. So for example, we've kind of already seen padding, but here's an example with margin, right? So with margin, I can declare 1, which means it's the same all the way around. So if I say margin 0, there's no margin all the way around on that object. If I use 2 things, it's top and bottom, right and left. And then I think it's top and bottom, right and left if you use 3. But if you use 4 expressions, it's top, right, bottom, left. And most professionals tend to use the bottom approach. It's either the bottom approach or the top. We're either doing the same thing all the way around, or they're controlling each side separately. And this is a convenient way to do it separately. Same is true with padding. Now with these, I do feel compelled to demonstrate. So let's get into coding mode. So I'm going to get, you can see I do have Dreamweaver already open here. I was doing some file uploads with it earlier. I do want to close all the work I actively have open, and I do want to go to my web programming fall 22 website setup. And I want you to notice here in the window, I did have like Unit 4 work from last week. And what I normally would do is if I was working on a project in reality, I would just do my file management right in this little side panel. but not all of you have that feature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my actual file system where this stuff exists. For me, it's my G drive. I'm going to find that folder where I have my web work. That's 152.101. And then if you remember, I made a 2022 fall folder, and there's my unit 2, 3, and 4. Now, this should be your pattern. When you start unit 5, don't make a unit 5 folder straight up. What I just do is I just right click, I copy, I paste it back in, and then I rename it and call it unit 5. Notice no spaces, no uppercase. And then inside here is my unit 4 stuff, right? That I haven't started working on yet. But the beauty of this approach is my unit 4 stuff is intact. So I screw up unit 5 stuff, I can go back to unit 4 and have a starting point. I don't have to start from scratch. That's why you don't want to keep working on the same version every day. So this is an important professional consideration here, right? And I say this with all sincerity. Whenever you're working on a really big website project, and I used to do this to the point of ad nauseum when I was younger, is I spent 8 hours working on this project yesterday, and now I'm coming in today. I want that work to stay intact because I put a lot of time into it. And now today I'm going to make a complete copy of it and start fresh today. And if I screw up, because it does happen, you completely screw it up, I can go back to yesterday's work and I'm okay. Right? Anytime you do a major change, I think that's smart. So I have the folder created now. And if I come back here in the project, oops, I just want to do a refresh here. Refresh the bar. So I just want to see my unit 5 folder, and I want to go to House of the Dragon. That's where I'm going to do my work. And you know what? I'm going to open up my index page, but I think what might happen is I might also start maybe creating another page just to goof around with, because I don't think I have a lot on my about page, right? There's not a lot of stuff here, but I can do a live look at it. Yeah. So this will be a good page to play with. Now, if you guys remember last week when I was working on this, I was kind of tweaking a lot of the CSS, and we did play with a couple of these settings already. So we played with padding, for example, and this is for the container, which is the bigger outer box. And now I did say 50-50, which means top and bottom, right and left, right? So top and bottom, right and left. But since they're the same, one is actually okay, right? And you notice how the page above didn't change at all. If I switch that to 150 for padding, watch what happened to the page real quickly, right? So it's putting 150 of padding inside the container all the way around. Now you might like that look, or you might think that's horrible. I think it's a little excessive for this. 50 is fine. Okay, so that's an example of padding, but as I hover here, please take a look at this panel that Dreamweaver pops up. And one of the reasons I like teaching the CSS stuff with Dreamweaver is I could also have expressed each one of the paddings separately, top, right, bottom, left. Notice they follow the same order, go around clockwise on the object. And if I wanted, I could spell out each, so I could have each separate thing spelled out. So I could say padding top, 50 pixels, padding right, make it a different amount, padding bottom, make it a different amount. And it's all very subjective, depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? And in some ways, it's better to spell them out individually, but if they are indeed all the same, you can use one term like I did, or if they start getting different, right? So I could go 50, I could go 40, I could have a 0, and then I could have a 10, right? Now, I will get students going, why don't you put PX after the 0? Shouldn't you? And I'm like, yeah, I could. But think about this. If it's 0 pixels or 0M or 0% or 0 points, it's all functionally the same. It's still 0. There's nothing, right? So you don't really actually need it, is kind of the point. But, you know, a lot of people would say, oh, you should do that. Now, I don't think these particular amounts are good ones. I do like the consistency of one padding all the way around. But notice that that padding exists separate from the border. It's operating on the space from the border in towards the content. And it doesn't matter that the content is a whole collection of basically the whole page, right? Maybe a better example would be to work on this particular box. So this one's called whatever dash padding. Okay, really clever name, but I can find that here. Right, so here's an example of the padding. We've used all these different settings. Now, they were also talking about margin, so I think it's important that we experiment with that one. So let's just use a kind of large amount here. You can say 100 pixels and see what this did. And I'm just going to kind of cut that. So here it sits with its goofy padding. And then the moment I add the margin, watch the change. So where did the space happen? Outside the border. So this is the margin. And when we say 100 pixels from what? From whatever the next object is on the screen. So maybe, just maybe, and I'm just kind of putting it out there, I don't want a 100 pixel margin all the way around. I maybe only want 10 pixels on the top. You can see the changes I make here. When I add a second term, you're just going to add, right? And I can keep going here. And then you can start playing with all of these values, folks, and experimenting, really. I mean, and that's how you see how stuff works, is by playing with those changes. And there usually is some sort of a solution to get things close to what you want it to be by playing with those things. So this one is an example of margin. Right, so let's go back to that PowerPoint. So I think we played with padding enough last week, played a little bit with margin now. Now I will give you guys a little bit of a thought on margin. Margin can be a little bit dangerous, especially when you start to work with responsive layouts and fixed or relative positioning, because it can break layouts. Margin can. Padding typically doesn't. So I usually like using padding more than I use a margin, by the way. So here they're kind of like bringing us back. So as you look at this slide, they're bringing us back to the thought of, okay, how can I see this on an actual page? So here, the words are the content in both of these boxes, but notice with this one, the words inside the box are touching the edge of the box, right? So functionally, there is zero padding in the lower box, right? Whereas you look at the top one, here are the words, and there's a space between like the edge of the E and the border, so that indicates that we have padding. Looks like we have padding on the top, the left, the bottom, and probably the right, but we can't see that until we get all the way over. With this one, you can see it because we're getting almost to touching the edge of the box before we come back, so there's really no padding there. So it's content, padding, border, and then margin. The only indicator of margin here is that we have a little margin above, because otherwise the box would float up to the top of the screen, and then a little margin below. Interesting to note that the browser window itself, and I don't know what it is on all the browser brands, but I think it's about 5 pixels or 4 pixels that they have as padding inside the browser window. So if somebody's coding a page and they don't know what they're doing, the words don't actually touch the edge of the screen. I think that's kind of interesting. Now, one issue that we often have in working with this stuff, and I think it's kind of bizarre, is the moment we start playing with padding and margin, we are fundamentally altering the size of the content on the screen, right? So if I just have words, the words occupy the space of the words. But if I add padding, border, and margin to it, all of a sudden that object is bigger than what it was originally, and that can be an issue. So what a lot of designers do is they use this special piece of CSS code. You can copy it right from here if you wish. And for those of you in the session here it is in the chat. But this little command is one that's really popular with a lot of modern designers, because what it says is, if I set the size of an object, it will always be that size, even if I add padding to the object. So I really kind of have to demonstrate this so you get kind of my point on it. So here goes. Let's go back here, and I think that what might be pretty wise is I'm looking at this and this about page is great and everything, but I need like another page here. So I'm going to actually come over here and I'm going to make a copy of my page. I'm going to do it internally on Dreamweaver. Normally you would do this in your file system. So I copied this page and now I'm going to paste it back in. And so you see I have a copy, and then I'm going to do a rename on it. And what do we want to call this? Let's just call it the dragon page. Okay, so we call dragon.html, which is an exact copy of my about page. But I did that so I can just kind of goof around with stuff in here and not break other things. And so I'm going to start by looking at my HTML. In fact, I'm going to just stay in code view here. And mostly, when you create new pages, the header and the navigation typically aren't going to change. But I did add a page, right? So my navigation actually does have to change. So why don't I go through and on all my pages, I'm going to add a link to the dragon page so I can access it from every page. So this would be an example of one thing that you would do for your site building assignment. And that one's called Dragon, DR, and see, it just fills it in for me. Thank you, Dreamweaver. But notice, because it's named all lowercase, really easy to know what the name is, right? That link does have to appear on all the pages. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to my index page, and I'm going to add it to the, well, see here I have a contact one. Isn't that interesting? I'm going to replace contact with dragons. And then I should probably, and see, I made that change to the about page, not the dragon page, but now all the pages have it. Then Dreamweaver also has a tool where I can save all the open files that were changed. Most of your IDEs do have that, by the way. So I changed 3 pages and a style sheet, actually, because we did some tweaks to that. And so now if I go ahead and do a preview, and I'll look at this in Chrome. So here's the pages. So here is home. Well, okay, so I have some issues. And I look at my navigation. So the home page is fine because there's a spacing here, but the about page is not, and the dragons page is not. So I got to add those spaces in. All right, back to the drawing board. These are the kind of things that you notice. So I had those spaces in between the menu items, and frankly, there's a better way to fix that, and that'll be one of the points of demonstration here, because putting spaces in to control the spacing of menu items is actually kind of silly. So I'm going to save all again. Let's go back to that browser, and now you'll see that all the pages, the menus are all spaced out. So these 2 pages, yes, they look exactly the same because they are, right? They're clones of each other. So there's the home, about, and dragons. Right. So I'm going to do most of my work on the dragons page, but now I have the page set up and the menu is all set. All right, so let's then start to think about, I need something that that's going to make this page a little bit different. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a heading in here. So I'll do a H1. And maybe I'll just do a H2 and say dragons. That's the name of the page. I'm not sure what I'm going to put down here, but I do know that for demonstration purposes, I'm going to create a bunch of divs, and I'm going to start giving them names so I can mess with them individually. So because I want them to be individual, I'm going to give them IDs. And so I'm going to call this 1. I'm struggling here for good names today. And maybe I'll create another div. Yeah, I want you to notice I'm starting out with blank ones, right? And I'll call this one very cleverly 2, right? Notice there's no content in these divs, right? So if I save this HTML, I just did a Control S, I go to the live view of the page, there's nothing to look at because div 1 and 2 exist, but they have no size or shape. Okay, so this is helpful, honestly, for figuring out how this box model works. And let's do a refresh there. Okay, so there's the Dragons page as it appears in the actual browser. All right, let's go in now and start to give size and shape to those divs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my style sheet and I'm going to stay in code view. And then, I'm just going to go way to the bottom of my CSS code. And I'm going to create a style for 1 and a style for 2. They're both IDs, so each will start with a £. So I'll say 1, here's my curly brackets, and now I'm ready to style that. And let's do the same thing for 2. So £2, curly brackets, and a space in between. All right. So let's start by doing this. Let's give it some size and shape. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a width. So I'm going to say width, and let's come up with a size here, 300 pixels. All right. I'm going to give it a border, and I'm going to say 3 pixels, solid line, and I don't know. Well, I'm going to use the color picker here. Get something kind of purpley but dark purple. All right. Once I have my color, I can type it in. So Dreamweaver does this by default. It just uses RGBA, but you can use any color you want. You want to use a named color or a hex color, up to you. Okay. So I give it a width. I give it a border, and you know what? Let's also do a background color. And well, if the border is purple, what would work well with a purple border, you guys? So I want to get the color picker going here, which is why I'm doing this. So how about that color, whatever it is? Okay, so that's my background color. I just kind of randomly picked it. Okay, so I did give it a width, but here's I'm just being silly. I didn't give it a height. Okay, so I'm going to give it a height also, and in this case, let's make it 200 pixels. Let's go ahead now that I've done this preliminary work, and I will bring up that split screen view. So I've created a box. Okay, not that impressive, but there it is. There it is, a box on the screen that I can see through. Somewhat, but there it is on the screen, and here is the CSS that gets it there. Right. Let's do the same thing with the number 2 box. So, to save a little time typing, I'm going to grab this code. I'm just going to paste it here, and then I am going to tweak. I'm going to tweak these things. So I'm going to make it maybe a little less wide and a little less high. So 200 pixels by 100 pixels. We'll do the same borders. Borders doesn't matter so much. Let's choose a different color for the background. Let's just choose one on the screen here. Aquamarine is fine by me. Okay. Saving the work, back to split screen view. So here are my 2 boxes. Okay. Let's also go back to the HTML code here. So this is in the, am I putting that on the wrong page here? I'm putting it on the about page, not the dragon page. All right, so here's what I'm going to pull them. So, gosh, I really screwed this up, didn't I? I'm saying this is all right, this is the dragon page. All right, so I'm fixing it. I'm doing all my edits on the about page. Sorry, All right, so really it should be about. So let's change. I'm going to go to my HTML here. About. All right, sorry about that. It just shows you how easy it is to kind of make a mistake. Okay. So now that I have these here, now a div, I want you to keep this in mind. A div is an object that's a container, right? And it's a block level container, so it fills the whole width of the screen and whatever object it occupies. And Right now it's empty. Now I could put inside, like where my cursor is flashing right now, I could put anything I want, images, words, whatever. Let's put some words in here, and whatever is a good word to put in there, and this will be whatever too, right? Okay, once again, let's take a look at the result. So you see the words, but you see how the words touch the edge, right? Not a good look. So how do I get them away from the edge? Now, this might not resonate with you immediately, and I understand that, but with 1 and 2, to get the words away from the edge, padding is what operates in between the content and the border. So if I add padding to each one of these, and let's do 30 pixels, you saw the first box moved, and then that seemed like a good padding amount. Let's add the same padding amount to number 2, and now you'll see that box also adjusted. So here's the adjusted view. I have to admit that looks a little better, right? Now I'm noticing that I don't like how the boxes sit on the screen, right? And so what I might do now is think about adding a little bit of margin. So maybe the first place I would start with number 1 is I might say margin, and I'm going to do this individually to start with, margin left 50 pixels. So it moved. Okay, that's kind of okay. Notice it didn't affect the second box. Then I also notice the boxes are touching. That's not a good look. So maybe I do margin bottom 20 pixels. You see how I pushed the other box away, right? Now, once again, I can specify each side separately, or I can be clever and I can come up with one amount that works for everything. And maybe that's too much space between boxes, or maybe that's fine. Or I can use one of the abbreviated techniques to either list each side separately, or left and right can have one thing and top and bottom can have something else. And I think top and bottom should maybe be 20, and then left and right could be 50, 550. Same thing you can do down here. So if you want to experiment with that, you might do the same thing. So you might say margin, and if we're going top right, bottom left, I might do like 10 pixels on top. I'm not worried about the right, so I'm going to leave it at 0. Bottom can be, I don't know, 20, something weird, like 24 pixels, and then left can be like 80 pixels. And then here is the code, there's the result. I'm just kind of playing a little bit with all of those aspects. Now jumping back to the slideshow, and talking about this border size property. So I want you to take a look at this in the browser now, and we're going to use a new tool that we haven't used in this class yet, but it's a really important tool in a browser. Some of you might know this tool already. So we've maybe already gotten in the habit of, like, whenever you're on a page, you can right click and do view page source, right? So what that means is I can look at the source code. Okay, that's very useful, but there's this other mode called inspect. So you guys see this one down here at the very bottom of that box. And I think all the browsers call it inspect. One fair word of warning, and I can't do this off the top of my head for sure, but I think in Safari, older versions of Safari, the inspect tool is not there. You have to actually go in and turn on developer tools and then enable it. So you got, Mac people probably know what I'm talking about. But if you're in Chrome or Firefox, the inspect tool is there. When you click that, what it does is it opens up a panel. And right now, actually, it's not in its default mode. The default mode looks like this, where it comes up usually as a sidebar to your website. And it has a bunch of tools. Now, you can move these panels around, but this is a really bizarre tool because it allows me to look at all the objects on the screen and their CSS and a bunch of other aspects. It's a super, super powerful tool. It's a lot more granular control than the view source tool. and is used by web designers all the time when working on stuff like this. So here's what I'm going to do, and the reason I'm coming in here is you'll notice in the inspect toolbar right up here at the top, there's this little like arrow tool. And I am using Google Chrome, by the way, but Firefox has the same tool, so does Edge. If you click and enable that, that allows me to go over to the screen, and any object that I hover over, it gives me all the aspects of that thing. Now, I want you to notice really carefully at that little pop-up. It tells me the actual size of the object, right? The color of the font, the size of the font, the background color of the object, the margin and the padding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for us right now, those are kind of the key things that we're working with. Notice it also has an accessibility panel too, right? Where it kind of ranks your score, and it's giving me a little green check mark, which means okay, right? And if that was an X, I would worry about maybe the contrast isn't good or something like that. But I want you to notice that at the very top of that little box, it says that the div #1 is 366 pixels by 266. How did that happen? I told it to be 300 wide and 200 tall. Well, here's how that happens. If you look really carefully at this box, whenever I add 30 pixels of padding, and the padding is inside the box, that means 30 pixels all the way around. So that's 30 pixels on top, 30 pixels in the bottom. You add those two together, it adds up to what? 60 pixels. So I go from 300 pixels to 360. If I add in the size of the border also, if I remember right, the border was 3 pixels. And if I go like left, right, or top, bottom, that's adding a total of 6 more pixels. That's why it's 366 by 266. So what it's telling you is the combination of the content, the padding, and the border are adding up to make the object bigger than 366. So this is why it takes a little while to kind of explain this concept. This style allows me to override that, right? And say, if I use box sizing border box, that means whenever I say width 300, it's exactly 300 pixels. So I'm going to add this to my style sheet, and I'll show you exactly what will happen. So we're going back to Dreamweaver, and I'm going to put that style way at the top of my sheet. There's several concepts happening here simultaneously. So the first is, talking about the style, but there's also this, which is an asterisk. And the asterisk in CSS means wildcard. That means every object on the screen will now have the box sizing property set to border box, which means whatever width I set, that's the width it is. So if I do a save all on this now and go back to my browser, which I'm about to do here, and then hover over that object, now take a look at the inspect box. It now has switched back to the size I intended, 300 by 200. Okay, why is this important? As designers, when we start to put stuff on the screen, like I can see this and go, I could move this box and put it up here next to it if it fits, right? But when I start changing the size of an object with padding and borders and stuff, every pixel is counted, so I might not be leaving enough room for myself. So people use the border sizing box property basically to make sure that things are the size they want you to be without having to do extra math to figure it out. Because I might go, I want a border that's 1 pixel thicker, and you make it 1 pixel thicker and the whole layout will break. Now, if that happens to you when you're building your page, the first thing you have to do is not freak out, right? Because it's fixable, right? So you can remove that pixel and make it go back. Don't then try to compensate the size of everything else in order to get it to fit. I think this box sizing property is particularly useful for people such as yourselves who are starting out. And a lot of pros use it too as kind of a general thing they do on every web page, is they throw this in. And then whenever I declare a width and a height of an object, it will be exactly that size. If I remove that, and I'm just going to remove it here for the sake of example, so I'm just going to do my CSS commenting here. Then when I look at the web page, the box jumps back up in size. And the only way I can know what the size is exactly is to come into the inspect tool and look, or do all the math of the border and the top and the margin and the padding and add them all together. Interestingly, padding and border affect the size of an object. Margin does not. So I can increase the margin to like ridiculous proportions, which can totally break the layout also, but does not change the size of the object. Only border and padding do, and those are really kind of a hard lesson to learn unless you're actually doing it. But that's why this style exists. So this is a really strongly recommended thing. The other thing that is kind of interesting, and the next thing that we're going to learn about is this concept of what we call normal page flow and floating, right? And so here's this graphic is really very telling, because this graphic shows basically the one on the left shows the same kind of thing that we're doing right now in class, which is here's a box, and then I made another box. And in my HTML code, it's two separate pieces of code. And because they're a div, the div fills the entire area of the screen left to right for wherever it is in the code, and then this one does too. In my scenario, I'm kind of leaving enough room here, right? Where, I mean, it looks like I could take this box and put it up here if I wanted to, right? But it's not going up there because the normal page flow says, and here's where the inspect tool is very helpful once again. When I look at these objects, and I'm doing the different thing now is I'm going to the HTML part of the code here, and as I hover over, okay, that's my container. I'm trying to figure out how they're breaking this down. Oh, I see. That's a Dreamweaver. I gotcha. So because we're seeing this as a Dreamweaver thing, it's putting it inside of other containers. So here, let me do this. I'm just going to open the page normally in the browser. And we are looking at the About page. So here it is just normally in the browser. Inspect panel turned on. And then I can find my code here in the main section of the document. So there's div 1. And so I think this is a really telling graphic, because that yellow or orange or whatever color you want to call that goes all the way across fills that whole space. So that's why this one doesn't move up, because that also occupies the whole space, right? So that's what we call normal page flow. So it's really kind of weird. So if it appears first in the HTML, then it appears first. If it appears second in the HTML, it appears second, and that page flow is maintained. Now we can do these weird things, and float is really the next concept here. But we can alter code. So for example, I can change the float of an object. And here's this image here is very telling, because this is a scenario you might want to recreate. So you might have like a title, and then you have some words, and then you have a picture of this, yellow, whatever it is, yellow lady slipper. And you want the picture to appear to the right of the text. Now, normally with regular objects, we would have an issue with this. And the issue is that a paragraph occupies the whole screen, and this particular image does not. So they're showing you here the CSS for getting an H1, right? A paragraph, and then this object, which is an image, to float right. And so what it's doing is it's floating right on the screen and fills in the space that it can. And then we have these other properties which stop the float, because what happens if you're floating an image, right? And then you want to continue with your words, but then this kind of stuff starts happening where the words start to overlap the image or whatever. And so then we have to use the clear property. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of demonstrate these techniques, because I think what the author does here is they very quickly go from point to point, but unless you see how it really works, you don't kind of get it, right? And so I have to really kind of demonstrate it. So let's do this one piece at a time with code. I'll do a little bit of this, and we'll take another break, you guys, just so you know. All right, so my first objective is to take this green box and move it up next to this one. So the first thing I'm going to do is, well, I'm going to go back to Dreamweaver for starters. I'm going to just go into code mode, and I'm going to start to like think about these two objects, which are basically controlled with this code. Right? So the first thing I want to do is if I want one object to be on one side of the screen and the other object to be on the other side of the screen, I have to use that command called float. Now, usually when I use a float command, I tend to put it at the top. And so I'm going to say float. Now with the first box, I'm going to float it to the left. I want to go to the left side of the screen. With the other box, number 2, I want to float that to the right side of the screen, maybe, right? And I say maybe, and you'll see why in a second. So now if there's enough space, those objects will move. So I'm kind of being brave here. I'm going to go to the live view inside here, and here's what happens. Okay, so now in principle, in my mind, it was like, you know what? This should be easy. So here's what happened in reality. This floated to the left side of the screen, which made enough room for this to float to the right side of the screen. But what I forgot about, and this is the thing that happens when you first start learning this, is there's stuff below that then was like, well, all right, this one went that way, this one went that way. There's still some room up there. I'm going to go up in the middle. So what happened is the other content in its normal page flow moved up and filled that space. Now here's a really kind of interesting experiment. What if I take 2 and instead of floating it right, I float it left? Interesting change, right? So it went up there, filled in the space, but it still left space for the text below in the footer to move up. Now, I don't want my footer looking like this, folks. I want that footer to be at the bottom and to stay there. And so what happens is whenever you use a float command, and this is really, really important, when you start using one and you start pushing things one way or the other, you have to remember to tell your page to stop floating too, which is what the clear property is all about. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to see, do I have a style for footer anywhere? I don't. I'm also going to look at my HTML source code. So I'm going to go into code mode here, just HTML. And what I have is my main section. It's got an H2, a div, and then from there I go to an HR and then my footer. And you know what? I think that HR would probably be better inside the footer. But when I want to fix this floating problem, the trick is you go to the next HTML object in your code. In this case, it's the HR. And I am going to put a class on it. I'm just going to call it clear float. And this is kind of a strategy. So the next HTML object on the screen, and I'm attaching to it clear float. Right? Now I'm going to go back to my style sheet now, and at the very bottom, I'm going to add that style. That is a class, so it's going to start with a dot. Dreamweaver auto fills it for me. Thank you very much. And now the command is simply this: clear, both. It clears left float and right float. You can actually choose them selectively, but I usually clear both. Right? So now when I bring the live view back up, notice how the footer now is back to the bottom. And the reality is, it's that this line here got the clear, right? And you don't see it. So that white line got the clear on it. So now the floats kind of work like they're supposed to. That's called normal page flow. And so this is kind of interesting. So if I do a save all on this, and then I go back to my browser in either version, but I would have to refresh. Let's refresh. I'll close the inspect panel. It doesn't matter the screen width here either, or does it? And so here's where it kind of gets weird, right? So I want you to watch this. So here's like regular width. We start bringing it in closer and closer, and now we start pushing on the size of the objects, and eventually those objects won't fit in the space that we have. And the one that's floated, the first one that's floated now doesn't have enough room, so it drops down. But hey, that would work okay for a responsive website, wouldn't it? Right, so that's one of the tricks, and this stuff is staying in place. So that's an example of float. Now there is another way to get rid of the float. So what they're showing here is they did a clear left. I did a clear both. I always think that's a safer choice, by the way, but they just did a clear left. Another thing that you can use to get rid of a float is also to do the overflow property. So in other words, what they're doing is they're applying this thing called overflow to the paragraph above, which allows it to grow in size to not only go down part of the image. See, like that one goes down here. This has the overflow turned on, and then that way that also clears the flow. So one technique or the other, depends on what you're doing, right? It comes with a little bit of experimentation. All right, so that is the float and clear. Let's do a break, you guys.